The young officer's hand sliced through the air, his voice sharp and his stance rigid. Around him, the quiet conversations of senior officers faded into curious silence. The woman he spoke to showed no reaction. Lieutenant Commander Aaron Carter simply continued filling the coffee cup, her movements steady and controlled, unbothered by all the stares. Soft laughter rippled through the group. Someone muttered, "Support staff getting brave these days." Carter set down the cup gently before responding, her voice smooth as steel. "Understood, sir." He pushed harder, speaking louder now, performing for everyone watching. "Wait outside, please. This meeting is classified." She finally met his eyes, not with anger but with quiet confidence. Her clear blue gaze held steady. "I have clearance for this meeting." More laughter echoed around the room. Then the heavy door swung wide. Admiral Hensley walked in mid-conversation, scanning faces until he spotted her. He froze. "Commander Carter," his voice dropped low. "Ghost Eye." Everyone fell silent. "Before we continue, please subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you won't miss these powerful tales of bravery. And share in the comments where you're watching from today. Lieutenant Commander Aaron Carter was 34 years old. Her bearing and the controlled precision of her movements made her seem more experienced than her years suggested, shaped by hardship rather than age. 2 years had gone by since the helicopter crash in the Gulf that destroyed her flying career. Medical staff called her recovery extraordinary. Carter called it incomplete. A slight limp remained, proof that metal and memories don't heal the same way. Headquarters moved her to Naval Intelligence, a desk job where battles were fought with information instead of altitude. Her uniform looked plain compared to the decorated ribbons and polished badges surrounding her. She wore a standard olive flight suit without any decorations except for a worn falcon patch on her left sleeve, the only piece of her former squadron she'd kept visible. Around Pearl Command, nobody discussed her background much. Official records were classified. Gossip filled in the blanks. Some believed she'd flown spy missions. Others whispered about a rescue operation that went terribly wrong. None of them actually knew the truth. Carter arrived before sunrise, well before anyone made coffee, and frequently stayed past midnight, translating intercepted communications that others avoided. She spoke little, smiled rarely, and worked with a focus that belonged to someone still running missions in her mind. When people walked past her in hallways, they noticed the slight limp, the way she carried herself with complete composure, and mistook it for weakness. The new personnel labeled her the coffee person, the invisible helper behind the meetings, the woman who managed supplies while real officers made decisions. She never corrected them. Pride didn't matter when you were just trying to survive. Each insult bounced off her armor of silence and disappeared. She'd learned long ago that the noisiest room often gets the quietest soldier completely wrong. At night, when the harsh lights dimmed and the base grew still, Carter sat alone beneath the hum of computers, the glow of screens lighting her face in blue. She traced coordinates across a digital map, the same area where her helicopter went down, and breathed through the pain in her leg. Every code she broke, every report she completed was another mission accomplished on the ground, since she could no longer fly above it. She didn't need recognition. She didn't even need anyone to remember. But somewhere deep within the silence of her daily routine, a sense of purpose still pulsed, the same one that had carried her through fire, sand, and tragedy. And though nobody in that building yet realized it, Lieutenant Commander Aaron Carter had once been the eyes in the sky that every Marine prayed for when everything went wrong. The first meeting after Admiral Hensley's arrival was meant to be routine. Updates, budgets, new procedure. For most officers, it was a morning to look professional. Exchange small talk, practice jargon, and get a signature from leadership. For Officer Evan Baird, it was also a chance to show initiative. Unfortunately, his version of initiative came with volume. He was the type of officer who lived through posture, chin raised, hands locked behind his back, every word sharpened by the eagerness of someone wanting to be noticed. The only person he seemed to notice less than himself was the quiet woman in the flight suit, who stayed near the edge of the room. "Ma'am, you can leave those cables there. The tech team will handle it," he said when he saw Aaron Carter kneeling beside the projector table, untangling a spool of fiber. His tone sounded polite on the surface, but hollow underneath. Carter didn't look up. "They're incorrectly aligned, sir. If we start like this, the main feed will lag by a full second." He blinked, caught off guard. "I'm sure it'll work fine." She kept threading the line through the floor port, her fingers steady, movements practiced. The whir of cooling fans filled the pod. A few senior officers watched, smirking as if the scene was entertainment between meetings. A colonel leaned toward another, voice quiet but not quiet enough. Did HR send us a barista or a pilot today? Soft chuckling spread through the group. Carter said nothing. She wound the remaining cable neatly, slid it under the console, and stood without meeting anyone's gaze. Ready when you are, sir, she said, voice controlled. Evan Baird cleared his throat, pretending authority. We'll start once the Admiral arrives. He didn't thank her. He didn't think he needed to. In his mind, she was support staff, someone who just happened to know where the wires went. The room settled into the rhythm of waiting. Casual conversation drifted like background noise. Sports scores, weather, deployment gossip. Carter stood near the back wall, arms loosely folded, attention fixed on the main screen. When the Admiral entered, the change was immediate. Everyone straightened. Conversations died instantly. Admiral Hensley's presence filled the room like gravity. His calm, deep voice set the tone as he began the meeting. Carter's role should have ended there. Silent observer, nameless assistant. But fate has a way of tearing silence open at the edges. Midway through the briefing, the Admiral gestured to the wall display. Next slide. Officer Baird pressed the remote and a satellite map appeared. An aerial view of the Gulf corridor marked with mission zones. He began reading from the report summary, his voice quick and rehearsed. Sector Delta, coordinates at 82.153 sub. This is the current flight restriction line. Carter's eyes narrowed. The numbers triggered a memory. Desert wind, radio static. A ridgeline burned into her vision forever. She took a slow breath. Correction, sir, she said quietly. Heads turned. Baird blinked. Excuse me. Carter's tone stayed even. The coordinates on that slide are wrong by 2 clicks east. The actual restriction line runs at 82.753. Laughter erupted again, easy and dismissive. Baird smirked as if she'd just confirmed his assumptions. Carter didn't react. If you check the live overlay, you'll see the mistake. Admiral Hensley turned to the tech officer. Verify it. The officer's fingers flew across the keyboard. The projection flickered, data adjusted, and the new line appeared exactly where Carter said it would. A hush spread through the room. Thin but noticeable. The Admiral gave a short nod. Correction accepted. Good catch, Commander. Nobody laughed this time. Baird's ears reddened. He cleared his throat and forced a small smile. Appreciate the sharp eye, ma'am. She offered no reply. Her expression remained neutral, eyes fixed on the map as if the coordinates mattered more than the people around her. But the silence didn't last long. Pride never enjoys being corrected, especially in front of senior officers. The jabs returned in subtle forms. When the briefing paused for coffee, Baird gestured toward the side table. Commander, if you're refilling, I'll take mine black. A ripple of amusement circled the room. Carter walked past him without a glance. Come on, muttered a Marine major. She's not actually. Relax, Major, Baird interrupted. I was just joking. But everyone heard the edge in his voice, the defensive pride of someone desperate to recover lost ground. Carter returned to her corner, eyes scanning the map still glowing on the wall. The Gulf Corridor, Sector Delta. She'd flown that route countless times. The heat shimmer, the radio interference, the sound of her co-pilot's breathing over the intercom. The night everything changed came rushing back. Warning lights, smoke, the split-second choice to land rather than eject. Now standing in a sterile room under harsh lights, she was watching her own history being presented by people who only knew it through reports. The irony wasn't lost on her. Have you ever watched someone humiliated in silence and wondered how long they'd endure it? Carter's jaw tightened, not from anger, but from restraint. She'd learned long ago that dignity survives best when protected by patience. The second half of the meeting began. Charts of signal intercepts replaced maps. Officers exchanged theories, each trying to sound more knowledgeable than the last. Baird's voice threaded through the noise, demanding attention he hadn't earned. Based on these coordinates, he explained, enemy frequencies align roughly here. He circled an area with his laser pointer, completely unaware that he was tracing the exact valley where Carter's helicopter had crashed. She stared at the red beam sweeping across terrain she remembered in perfect detail. The craters, the twisted metal, the silence after impact. The smell of burning oil returned uninvited. Her heart beat faster, not from fear but from memory. She drew a slow breath, anchoring herself in the present. The hum of electronics, the faint click of pens. She focused on breathing until the ghosts faded. The Admiral continued asking questions, each one drawing information from the officers. Carter listened, occasionally writing notes on a pad she'd been told to use for attendance. She'd survived worse than this. Far, yet some small part of her wondered how many more insults she'd absorb before someone remembered she once wore wings. The conversation turned tactical. One senior captain questioned the reliability of flight data from a prior mission. Carter's attention sharpened at the coordinates mentioned. They were hers. "The data is incomplete," said the captain. "Whoever flew that mission didn't maintain proper altitude. The pattern's all over the place." Carter closed her eyes briefly. "All over the place," he said. She could almost hear the chaos. The alarms, the calls for extraction, the flares lighting up the canyon. Erratic had meant staying low enough to draw fire so another helicopter could escape. Baird chuckled. Maybe that pilot was having a rough day. Something inside Carter shifted, subtle as the turn of a compass needle. Not anger, but a quiet realization that her silence had allowed lies to replace truth. She opened her eyes. That pilot held altitude because enemy radar was jamming the guidance system. The erratic pattern is countermeasure drift, not pilot error. Every head turned again. The captain frowned. "And how exactly would you know that, Commander?" She met his gaze steadily. "Because I analyzed that flight data personally." A beat passed. Then the Admiral said without looking away from his notes, "She's correct. That pattern saved another crew that night." The conversation moved on, but the temperature of the room changed. The laughter stopped completely. Still, Baird couldn't help himself. Insecurity makes noise when it's trapped. "Ma'am," he said as the briefing ended, forcing a grin. "Next time I need coordinates double-checked, I'll be sure to find you before the coffee run." It was meant as humor. It landed like a punch. Carter collected her notes, tucked the pen behind her ear and simply said, "Understood, sir." She left the room with the same calm she'd entered, though inside her pulse beat hard against the memory of rotor wash and dust, and the weight of someone else's life in her hands. Outside, the corridor was cool and quiet, the air heavy with the scent of polished metal. She leaned briefly against the wall, feeling the pain in her knee flare, then straightened and walked on. There was still information to process, still code to break before nightfall. Behind her, laughter resumed. Smaller now, thinner, like people laughing to convince themselves they still could. Inside the briefing room, Admiral Hensley stared at the updated map, at the small correction that had changed the entire tactical overview. He didn't say it aloud, but he remembered the call sign written on those mission files. Ghost Eye 07. And somewhere down the hall, the woman everyone thought was invisible was still moving with purpose, carrying history nobody dared to see. The badge clipped to her chest read LCDR Carter 04, insignia beneath. Most eyes slid past it. They saw the olive flight suit, the practical boots, the absence of ribbon bars, and their minds supplied a simpler label: staff, support, someone else's shadow. Yet the badge caught light whenever she turned, a brief flash that insisted on being noted. On her left wrist, a narrow band of titanium rested against skin pale from office lighting. The engraving was a secret carved into steel: Ghost Eye 07. No decoration, just letters and numbers, the way they had once been spoken over a headset in wind and smoke. Whenever she adjusted a cable or pressed a key, the bracelet slipped into view and vanished again, a periscope rising and sinking. Proof of a submarine nobody wanted to admit was there. Under the fluorescent lights, faces flattened. When the projector warmed, a softer glow moved across the room. In those moments, the scar along her temple emerged, a faint line, the color of early ash, at the edge of her hairline. It asked for nothing, it simply existed, a seam where the past had been stitched closed. People who noticed looked away quickly. Admiral Hensley's aide, a commander with quick hands and a careful face, saw all of it. He noted the badge first, rank and clearance balanced in the mental ledger he kept for the Admiral. Then the bracelet, then the scar. His eyes paused for half a heartbeat, the way a pilot's hands hover over controls in crosswind. He said nothing. He was paid in part to say nothing until the Admiral spoke. The day rolled forward, briefings, corrections, refills, the choreography of people who live by schedules. Carter moved through it without hurry, touching only what needed her hands. She was not hiding. She simply declined to announce herself. Whispers began like condensation, invisible until the room got cold. Two senior officers paused near the wall map, voices pitched toward discretion and missing it by a breath. "Ghost Eye. Wasn't that the pilot who—" The second officer hissed. "Not here." The phrase landed with a sharpness that admitted knowledge and forbade it at the same time. The first officer cleared his throat and changed subjects with the awkwardness of a stumble. "Weather window looks narrow this week." Nobody believed the pivot. Down the table, a Marine major turned his coffee cup and kept not looking at Carter. That's how you watch without being caught watching. You study a harmless object. When the bracelet flashed again, he stilled his hand. He had heard the call sign once in a tent where heat made the air taste of canvas and dust. He remembered a radio voice speaking those words like coordinates that meant rescue. The projector threw a new map onto the screen. Carter shifted weight off her left knee and lifted her chin slightly to avoid glare. Her badge squared under the beam. And again the 04 gleamed. Chairs creaked. The moment passed, labeled nothing, filed and forgotten by those who needed it forgot. Officer Baird tried to reassert control of the room. "Let's proceed," he announced. An unnecessary command that sounded like a boy throwing a stone into deep water to prove the depth belonged to him. He didn't glance her way. He had chosen his version of the room earlier. Barista, assistant, background noise. Information that contested his version had to be treated like interference. But information has patience. It waits and arranges itself into a pattern even stubborn eyes will see. The bracelet glinted when the conversation slid near certain coordinates, valleys and nights that smelled of burning oil. Ghost Eye 07 did not argue. It simply existed. Numbers do not plead. They declare. The aide stepped near the Admiral to pass a printed update. The Admiral's gaze moved over the room with the drift of a searchlight. Not hunting. Remembering. He too had memorized call signs that became epitaphs, and a few that meant an unexpected sunrise. If he noticed the bracelet now, he gave no sign. By the water station, Carter refilled the kettle without looking at anyone. Steam climbed in a narrow column that dissolved at the ceiling. Her reflection bent and straightened in the steel canister. A ghost image watching a living one do ordinary thing. When she turned, the scar caught the projector's edge again. A constellation the night refused to extinguish. The whispers kept pooling. Could be coincidence. Nobody from that unit came back stateside this quiet. Ask the Admiral. Don't. The sentences were brief, as if keeping words short might keep facts small. In military spaces, rumor is a survival skill. You learn to read the wind before it tears the tent down. The wind now smelled of something people call respect and feel as fear. She returned to the console when a thin audio squeal threaded the air. She lowered the volume a notch, adjusted the input, and the squeal died like a mosquito between palms. Her hands were steady. The titanium band flashed, and a young officer, fresh from flight school, mouthed the engraving to himself without sound. Ghost Eye 07. He looked toward the Admiral, then back down. The aide noticed the young officer noticed. He shook his head by a barely visible fraction. Not here, not yet. The young officer dropped his eyes to his notes and underlined nothing. 3 times. Outside, aircraft carved white lines across the morning. Their shadows passed over the building like migrating birds. Here and gone. Proof of engines you could not hear from inside. Carter felt the rhythm without needing the sound. Pilots measure time differently after certain nights. You count by the distance between breath and decision. Inside, the narrative still belonged to Rank and to those confident enough to fill silence with words. But silence kept a ledger. It added the badge to the bracelet, to the scar, to the aide's prolonged neutrality. And the sum grew. By midday the briefing had shed its arrogance. Laughter thinned into a quiet that pretended to be focus. When Admiral Hensley requested the next data layer, Carter brought it up without being asked. A small trespass of initiative that might have drawn a reprimand from a lesser leader. The Admiral offered a nod. The aide wrote nothing down and yet recorded everything. If you were watching, really watching, you could feel the room's center shift by a few inches toward the woman everyone had mistaken for a shadow. You could watch the story rewrite itself in slow handwriting. One clue at a time, until even the stubborn began to read. The satellite feed died the way engines sometimes do. Without drama. Just absence. One moment the Gulf corridor hovered in high-resolution detail across the screen. The next it collapsed into a gray grid and a blinking no signal in a font that looked insincere about problems. Conversations stuttered, then stopped. Chairs creaked. Someone exhaled too loudly. The room had spent the morning performing competence. Now competence had a tech, Admiral Hensley said, not raising his voice. Status. 3 uniformed technicians jolted into motion, pulling up diagnostics with the frantic calm of people who knew that speed was part of the ritual, even when speed did nothing. Cables were checked, inputs cycled, passwords re-entered with too many consonants. The same error message returned. As stubborn and dull as wet paint, Officer Evan Baird seized a remote like it might grant authority. He pressed buttons that didn't matter. He frowned at screens as if angles could fix circuitry. Probably a cash conflict. He said to nobody in particular. It was the kind of phrase that sounded smart enough to be left unquestioned. The Admiral watched without impatience, but also without indulgence. Waiting can be a kind of leadership. The aide hovered at his shoulder, eyes moving like quiet metronomes, between the frozen grid and the room that was trying not to stare at it. Carter was already moving. 2 steps to the side console, a look at the back plane indicator, a small recalculation happening behind her eyes. The problem wasn't the software, it was the backbone that carried it. She knew that feeling in machines the same way a medic knows fever by touch. "Permission to interface manually, sir," she said. Baird heard her first. He snorted. Reflex more than thought. "Ma'am, this isn't a coffee machine." A few officers smiled without commitment. The kind of half grin that says, "I might laugh if this goes your way, but I'll deny it later." Carter's expression didn't change. She wasn't asking him. Admiral Hensley didn't look at Baird. He looked at the darkened patch on the far rack where a fiber line bent a degree more than it should. Then he looked at Carter. Something like recognition moved in his face. Less aha. More. He gave a single nod. Carter knelt by the rack, the motion careful on a knee that complained softly each time she asked it for grace. She unlatched the access panel with the quick twist of someone who has not only read the manual but remembers why it was written. The panel swung open, revealing the patient rows of ports blinking in weary unison, a tangle of lines braided by convenience rather than care. She slid on anti-static gloves and reached in, not feeling for a cable so much as listening with her fingertips. Hums our signature. A stable trunk sings at a pitch your bones learn if you've worked long enough. In rooms like this, one line vibrated a fraction off tempo, like a string too tight for the song. "Hold primary," she murmured to the tech nearest her. "Isolate aux 3. I'm going to bypass the splitter and take a direct route into the switch. That'll drop the side displays," the tech warned. Only for a heartbeat. She pinched the latch, freed the fiber and let it arc into her other palm like a living thing that trusted her. A quick inspection revealed a micro-fracture near the ferrule, microscopic, but fatal under load. She rerouted to an open high-spec port, motion efficient, minimal, like controlled breathing on a long final approach. "Routing," she said. "Routing," echoed the tech, fingers already moving to mirror her path in the system. Carter rose halfway, leveraged herself against the rack, then slid onto the console stool without waiting to be offered a chair. She sent her credentials across the network like a salute and landed in the diagnostic shell, keyboard under her hands. She moved without decoration. No wasted keystrokes. No hunting. A short sequence called a low-level handshake for the satellite session. A second string killed a stubborn process, whose only purpose in life was to die when someone competent told it to. She wrote a tiny patch, barely 10 lines, that forced the session to renegotiate with the switch at a cleaner MT. It was elegant, not because it was clever, but because it did exactly one thing and refused to talk about it. On the screen the gray grid flickered. A smear of color returned like tides sneaking under a pier. The live feed snapped back in a rush. Coastline, thermal overlays, the jitter of moving targets reframed into steadiness. Side displays blinked out and in within the space of a held breath. "Feed restored," the tech said, relief breaking over his voice despite his training. The room didn't cheer. Competence does not invite applause in places that worship it, but quiet startled everyone into stillness. People turned not toward the screen, which they had expected to return, but toward Carter's hands hovering above the keys as if the machine might ask for more, and she would have it ready. Officer Baird's mouth was a shape that wanted to be an O and settled for a line. He recovered with a cough and a pointless observation. "Well done, tech team." It landed thin. Hensley's eyes went to the console and the cursor blinking after a string of commands. He knew that sequence, not the letters themselves, those could vary, but the cadence of the work, the order of operations that was less doctrine than habit formed in places where a second was expensive. When you have flown with a person over bad ground, you learn their grammar. Machines are just another kind of airframe. He did not speak. He did not need to. The silence after competence grew denser, like a canvas tent taking rain and holding it. Carter logged out, wiped the gloves against a microfiber cloth with the same economy she used for every movement, and closed the rack. She rose without asking for anyone's approval to stand. The pain in her knee flared, then withdrew, a tide's quick kiss on stone. She took one step back from the console to return it to neutral, as if leaving a cockpit trimmed and straight for the next pilot. "Carry on," she said softly. The Admiral's aide had been watching the whole time with the expression of a man who memorized. He wasn't taking notes, But later he could have reproduced the sequence down to the tiny pause before that last command, the one a nervous operator might skip. His gaze tipped to Carter's wrist when she lowered her hand. The bracelet winked. Ghost Eye 07, guarding its secret like a lighthouse guards its light, visible but only if you look at the horizon instead of the shore. Baird cleared his throat again, crowding into relevance. So as I was saying about the cache conflict, resume with the live layer, Admiral Hensley said, the kind of interruption that is a decision. His voice had sand in it now, grit from another theater entirely. Baird obeyed, chastened without understanding why. They moved on, at least in form. The overlay returned, data breathing across coastline in thermal tides. But the room had shifted. Respect does not always announce itself with words. Sometimes it just changes the way people sit in their chair. A colonel who had laughed earlier kept his eyes on the screen now, but he glanced sideways once, a small involuntary nod in Carter's direction. The body's concession when the mouth can't find the apology yet. The Marine major stopped turning his cup. The younger officers sat a little straighter, the way new pilots do when they realize the instructor in the next seat has more flight hours than the airfield has sunsets. Carter's breathing evened out. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt the relief of a pilot after a clean landing in crosswind. You don't celebrate, you taxi off. You clear the runway, you run the checklist. She returned to her quiet post near the wall with the same unassuming presence that had invited misjudgment all morning. And the misjudgment now had to find another host. The Admiral's gaze drifted past her and then back, a lazy circle like a reconnaissance orbit. He was not chasing nostalgia. He was aligning facts. The procedural signature on the console, the way she had asked for permission. Protocol first, action second, the speed with which she found the physical fault before addressing software. It was an old sequence. He had seen it in trailers lit by generator hum, in tents where maps fluttered under helicopter wash, in cockpits when instruments lied but hands did not. A lull stretched, the kind that tries to be ordinary and fails. Someone tapped a pen. Someone else stopped. When competence enters a room after being mocked, people look for cover. The easiest is paperwork. Baird attempted one more recovery. I'll file a ticket with communications about the faulty. I already tagged the port and logged the bypass. Carter said, not sharply, not kindly, simply offering the truth. It'll hold through the briefing. Recommend replacing the connector before the afternoon session. The tech nodded. I'll put in the work order now. Baird's jaw worked as if forming a sound might fix the shape of what had happened. He settled for a nod, and for the first time all day he didn't add a joke. The Admiral leaned toward his aide, voice low enough to be private, but not secret. Where did she transfer from? The aide didn't answer right away. He let the question hang as if the room itself might respond. At last, records list several units, sir. A beat. There's a redacted block that includes aerial reconnaissance and theater operation. Hensley's eyes returned to the console, then to Carter. Carter stood without fidgeting. She didn't fill the space with accomplishment. She let the machine's steady hum retake the room. Her face settled back into that neutral attention that reads from a distance as meekness. Up close it reads as focus. People confused the two at their peril. The briefing resumed with new momentum, clean, exacting. When data scrolled, it did so with confidence. Questions sharpened. Answers landed with fewer syllables. The rhythm had changed because someone had fixed it. You could almost forget the grid and its smirking error message had ever existed. Almost. In the back row, a young intelligence officer, eyes too new to be cynical, leaned forward and whispered more to himself than anyone else. How did she do that so fast? Nobody answered. The question wasn't about the keys. Hensley asked for an overlay of flight corridors and surveillance windows. The screen obeyed, docile now. His gaze held a private softness at the edges, the way a person looks at a familiar coastline after a long deployment. He let the moment breathe. Then he went on with the work at hand, because work is the religion of those who have seen what happens when it isn't done. The silence that followed Carter's fix didn't dissipate. It settled on lapels, on notepads, on the gap between rank and truth, and it stayed there. In it a thought that many people were having but none would say yet. The story in this room has changed its author. Would you have clapped or still doubted her? The meeting stretched into its final hour, the kind of fatigue-filled silence that comes after too much information and too many ego. Officers gathered their notes. Some stood, straightening uniforms as if distance from the table might erase what had happened earlier. The moment the coffee person fixed a system, half of them didn't understand. Admiral Hensley stayed seated, his hand resting on the table still. When he finally spoke, the low timbre of his voice cut cleanly through the rustle of papers.
Before we proceed, he said, there's someone here who doesn't need this briefing. Every sound stopped. The shuffle, the whispers, even the drone of the projector fan felt quiet. The Admiral rose, gaze sweeping the room until it anchored on Aaron Carter. She wrote it. A murmur stirred, small at first, then dissolving as his words settled like heavy dust. Carter stood by the wall motionless, hands clasped behind her back, expression neutral but alert. Hensley took a step closer, slow and deliberate. Lieutenant Commander Aaron Carter, call sign Ghost Eye, led aerial reconnaissance during Operation Trident Spear. He let the words breathe, let them.
2 aircraft were down that night. Communications failed. She flew alone through enemy fire to extract 6 Marines trapped in the valley. The silence that followed wasn't ordinary. It had shape, weight. It pressed down on every man and woman in the room. A young intelligence officer blinked hard, his hand frozen mid-note. The Marine major who'd laughed earlier straightened, the sound of his chair echoing too loud in the stillness. Even the projector hum seemed reverent now. Officer Evan Baird's mouth opened as if to speak, then closed again. He looked from the Admiral to Carter, confusion curdling into shame. The joke he'd made earlier, "This isn't a coffee machine," burned behind his eyes like something toxic. Admiral Hensley's boots echoed on the polished floor as he walked toward her. He stopped within arm's reach, his face softened, not by pity but by recognition, the kind reserved for those who stood in the same fire and survived. "We lost good men that day," he said quietly, "but she brought the rest home." He didn't add at a cost. He didn't need to. Everyone could see the faint limp, the thin scar at her temple, the way she carried weight invisible to anyone who hadn't known that kind of night. A few officers shifted uncomfortably. They hadn't known. That was the point. Hensley nodded once, as if concluding a classified briefing only 2 of them understood. "You don't forget a voice like hers on communications," he continued. "Calm under fire. We'd already written them off, but she kept flying. No cover, no backup, just grit and a promise." The Marine major whispered under his breath, "Ghost Eye," as if saying it aloud confirmed it was real. Carter didn't respond. She didn't bow or nod. She stood at ease, hands still clasped, eyes forward. The picture of composure. Her silence wasn't modest. It was the quiet of someone who had already lived through enough noise. Admiral Hensley turned back toward the room, voice steady but resonant. "Some of you have been studying data from those flights. Every coordinate you've analyzed, every intercept you've referenced. That's her work. The reason those logs exist at all is because she stayed airborne long enough to send them." You could almost hear the collective exhale, guilt, awe, and disbelief tangled together. Baird lowered his gaze. He wanted to apologize, to explain ignorance as innocence, but neither word would survive the air between them. Hensley glanced over his shoulder at Carter again, an unspoken understanding passing between them, the acknowledgement of a history nobody else in that room could carry. Then he faced the officers. "Respect is the currency of this uniform. Spend it wisely." He stepped back. "That's all." Carter inclined her head slightly, a gesture as small as it was unshakable. The Admiral returned the nod, a salute folded into silence. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The air held the kind of stillness that exists only after revelation. Papers remained untouched. Coffee cooled. Even the ever-busy Officer Baird seemed carved from stone, his throat working as he swallowed the bitter taste of his own arrogance. A whisper finally slipped from the back row. She was Ghost Eye. And then the room hushed again, unwilling to disturb the weight of what they now knew. Carter turned to the console, the same one she'd repaired earlier. The display glowed bright and steady, as if the system itself understood its operator had been restored to name and memory. Her hand brushed the titanium bracelet, Ghost Eye 07, and for the first time that day she allowed herself a breath that reached her chest instead of stopping in her throat. The Admiral watched her with quiet respect, then gave the faintest of smiles, the kind seen only between veterans of the same storm. "She doesn't just fix systems," he said softly, almost to himself. "She fixes what breaks when everyone else gives up." Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. When the Admiral finally dismissed them, chairs moved carefully, as if each officer feared making too much noise. Some offered small nods as they passed her. Others couldn't meet her eyes at all. Baird lingered, his voice barely audible. "Ma'am, I didn't know." Carter didn't turn. "You weren't supposed to." And with that she gathered her notes, tucked them under one arm, and left the room that had finally remembered her name. For a long moment, nobody moved. The revelation still hung in the air, alive, electric, impossible to retreat from. Admiral Hensley remained standing near the center of the room, his gaze steady on Carter. His face carried something that looked like pride and sorrow all at once, the expression of a man who had seen too many names carved into granite and was relieved that hers wasn't among them. He drew a slow breath, squared his shoulders, and raised his right hand. The salute came sharp and deliberate, cutting through the stillness like a bell in fog. Every head turned. The Admiral, the four-star whose word could make or break careers, was saluting the quiet woman they had spent the morning mocking. For half a heartbeat, nobody reacted. The officers sat frozen between disbelief and realization. Then chairs scraped the floor like thunder rolling across marble. One by one they rose. Colonels, majors, captains, every rank in the room straightened into perfect posture, uniforms snapping into order as if pulled by an invisible thread of shame and respect. The metallic click of heels striking together echoed off the sterile walls. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared. Lieutenant Commander Aaron Carter didn't move at first. Her eyes met the Admiral's across the gulf of silence. Blue meeting gray, past meeting present. Then with a calm that had carried her through fire and chaos, she raised her hand and returned the salute. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't triumphant. It was quiet, clean and absolute. Her palm met her brow with the grace of muscle memory, the motion so precise it felt like ceremony born from pain. The faint tremor in her fingers wasn't weakness. It was the echo of rotors, the memory of turbulence, the body remembering survival. Her eyes glistened just enough for the light to catch them, but her chin didn't drop. Around her the room stood suspended. Rank forgotten, pride dissolved. A heartbeat pulsed in the background, slow, steady, the rhythm of something sacred. The Admiral's hand lowered first, but not before his voice, low and rough, carried through the silence. "Welcome home, Ghost Eye." The words landed like a benediction. Carter lowered her salute, posture straight, her breathing measured. She gave a small nod. "Thank you, sir." Those who had laughed earlier, Officer Baird among them, stood at rigid attention, eyes fixed on the wall, faces flushed. The colonel who had joked about HR hiring a barista kept his gaze anchored to the floor. A single bead of sweat rolled from his temple, vanishing into his collar. For the first time since the briefing began, Carter was the calmest person in the room. If you were there, you'd swear you could hear nothing but the faint hum of the air system, and the sound of hearts realigning themselves with humility. The Admiral stepped forward, closing the space between them. "We don't salute enough of the living," he said softly. "We save it for the ceremonies, but this," his hand swept toward the officers, "this is one we owe." Carter's voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't do it alone, sir." Hensley nodded. "Nobody ever does. But you did it when nobody else could." For the briefest second, her eyes drifted to the floor, then lifted again, steady. A tremor of emotion passed through the line of officers, subtle but unmistakable. The Marine major's throat worked once before he spoke. Voice thick. "Permission to speak freely, sir." The Admiral nodded. The major looked at Carter. "We studied Trident Spear in training. We read the reports, the failures, the losses, but nobody ever said." He stopped, swallowed. "Nobody ever said you were Ghost Eye." Carter didn't answer. Her silence said everything words could not. The major straightened again, his voice steadier now. "Ma'am, it's an honor." That simple sentence felt like a confession. A collective apology carried on one set of shoulders. The others followed suit, not with words, but with their silence, their posture, their eyes that finally saw. The respect in that room no longer came from rank. It came from truth. Carter turned slightly, scanning the faces before her, the same ones that had laughed, doubted, dismissed. Their expressions were no longer smug, they were humbled. She saw something new flicker behind their eyes, recognition. For the first time she wasn't invisible. The Admiral took one step back, giving her the floor without saying so. The authority in that gesture was absolute. She hesitated, just a breath, before speaking. "We all wear the same flag. Some days we fly higher than others. Some days we just hold the line." Her voice was calm, grounded, real. "That day I held the line. That's all." Her words felt like rain, quiet, unforced, but cleansing. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "And the Marines came home. That's what matters." The Admiral's jaw flexed, his eyes glimmered for a fraction of a second. Then he faced the room. "You heard her. That's what matters." The officers remained standing even after protocol should have released them. It wasn't habit, it was instinct. Nobody wanted to break the moment. The hum of projectors returned, the faint sound of boots shifting on the floor. For a long stretch of time,
The world outside that briefing room might as well not have existed. If this were film, the camera would linger, tight focus on her face, faint light outlining the curve of her jaw, the distant reflection of her call sign bracelet, catching in the glow. The score would fade to nothing but a heartbeat, slow, deliberate, human. Humiliation had turned into reverence. The officers who once saw a coffee person now saw a combat veteran who had outflown death itself. Their respect wasn't performative, it was raw, and standing in that stillness, Erin Carter didn't feel vindicated. She felt, for the first time since the crash, she allowed herself to exhale without guilt. As the Admiral dismissed the room, nobody spoke. No chatter, no excuses. The silence that had once mocked her now protected her. When she finally turned toward the door, it was the sound of boots snapping to attention that followed her, a chorus of respect. She paused at the threshold, eyes tracing the flag that hung beside the exit, the same flag she'd stared at through cracked glass and fire 2 years early. Without looking back, she offered one final salute. The Admiral returned it instantly. Her hand dropped. The room remained at attention until she was gone, and in the echo that followed her footsteps, the air carried something heavy, sacred, an unspoken promise, whispered in the bones of everyone present. Never again underestimate the quiet ones. The room emptied slowly, as if nobody wanted to be the first to break the quiet. Erin Carter remained where she was, collecting her folders one by one, the same calm precision she'd shown all morning guiding her hands. Paper slid into her case with soft, steady sounds. The chair she'd used stayed pushed back an inch, exactly as she'd left it when the Admiral called her name. The officers who lingered did so awkwardly. They stood with posture too rigid for comfort, unsure whether to speak or to stay silent. The air had changed. The laughter and condescension of earlier now felt like ghosts nobody wanted to remember. Officer Evan Baird lingered near the corner, gripping a tablet he wasn't reading. Every few seconds he took a breath that sounded like it wanted to become a sentence, and then didn't. Finally he stepped forward. "Ma'am," he started, voice shaking in a register he hadn't used all. I didn't know." Carter looked up at him. There was no anger in her face, no triumph, only composure and something softer hidden behind it. She adjusted the strap of her case and said quietly, "You weren't supposed to." The words landed like forgiveness, wrapped in There was no accusation in them, only a kind of truth that made Baird nod, his throat too tight for words. He tried again. I read about Ghost Eye once. I just never." She cut him off gently. "Then now you have. Carry that forward." He nodded again, this time slower, understanding that some lessons arrive in silence and stay longer than lectures. Carter turned toward the door. The Admiral was still near the head of the table, speaking quietly to his aide. When he noticed her preparing to leave, he straightened. Their eyes met for the last time that day. He gave a small nod, not command, not dismissal, but respect. She returned it with the faintest of smiles, just enough to crease the corner of her mouth. As she walked past the rows of officers, they remained standing. Nobody sat until she reached the door. Boots clicked to attention as if by instinct. Chairs stayed untouched. Even the projector dimmed into standby, the room seeming to exhale only when she was gone. Outside, the corridor was long and quiet. Her footsteps echoed softly off the polished floor. The badge on her chest caught the light. LCDR Carter 04. She passed a line of windows where sunlight spilled across her path, and paused just long enough to breathe it in. The titanium bracelet around her wrist warmed against her skin. Ghost Eye 07. Inside the room behind her, the officers were still standing, staring at the table as if waiting for instruction that never came. Admiral Hensley broke the silence first. "Sit," he said, and they obeyed, though the sound of chairs scraping felt out of place after what they had witnessed. He looked at Baird, then at the others. "Let this be the last time you need a briefing to recognize valor when it's standing right in front of you." Nobody replied. They didn't need to. Every man and woman in that room would remember the image of her standing at attention, the quiet figure who fixed the system, corrected the coordinates, and carried a history none of them had the right to question. Carter moved down the hallway, the weight of memory behind her, and the hum of the bass ahead. She didn't smile, but her eyes softened as she passed a wall lined with photographs of aviators. Some living, some lost. One of them showed a Blackhawk climbing through haze, rotors blurred by light. She didn't stop to look closely. She didn't need to. In that moment, rank is worn on the collar, but respect is carried in silence, earned in places nobody saw. It's not handed out in briefings or printed on plaque. It's written in scars, in restraint, in the moments when a soldier chooses calm over pride. Sometimes the quietest person in the room isn't background noise. They're the echo of battles fought far from here, reminders that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just breathes and keeps moving. Carter reached the end of the corridor where sunlight spilled through an open doorway. She stepped into it without hesitation, her silhouette framed in gold. The door closed softly behind her. Inside the briefing room, Admiral Hensley stood once more and looked at the officers who had watched the transformation of humiliation into honor. "Dismissed," he said. But even after they left, the silence stayed, not empty this time, but full of respect. And somewhere out on the tarmac, a helicopter turned in the wind, its blades whispering the same truth the room had just learned. True strength doesn't need to speak, it just keeps flying. Some heroes don't need introduction. You can see it in the calm way they stand, the steadiness in their eyes, and the silence that says more than any medal ever could. They carry history in every breath. Missions survived, comrades remembered, promises kept. Lieutenant Commander Erin Carter never asked for recognition. She simply did her duty, and the world finally remembered to look. If you felt that, if stories like this remind you what quiet courage really looks like, then subscribe to Military and Veteran Story. These true accounts keep the spirit of service alive, proving that humility and valor often share the same uniform. And sometimes the loudest hero is the one who never speaks at all.